Hello everyone. Today we're going to begin with our discussions of the value-added sessions, and this is the first discussion. We're going to begin with environment. Okay, so यहाँ पर we're going to start with climate change, and सबसे पहली चीज जो हमें आनी चाहिए or something that we should know is that we should have an idea about the climate change negotiations. So it was the first time in 1972 that environmental issues reached the global stage. And this happened at the first International Environment Summit that took place in Stockholm, that is in Sweden. But this was not very specifically related to climate change, it was about environmental issues in general. Late 1970s आते आते 1970s late 1970s तक World Meteorological Organization started raising concerns about climate change globally. फिर eventually 1979 में the first World Climate Conference was held. And later on 1988 में Toronto Conference on the changing climate also took place. 1988 was the year that IPCC was established. Okay, so IPCC was established, and this IPCC was established with the aim of investigating and reporting on scientific evidence on climate change and also to get international response. So IPCC is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Come 1992, this was a very important year, and the first global agreement on climate change, that is UNFCCC, came into existence and was open to signature at the historic summit that is known as the Earth Summit in Rio. Then 2005 May comes the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, and 2015, a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, that is the Paris Agreement, was adopted. So what is important for us is the Paris Agreement. Now, Paris Agreement के जो key aspects थे, one of the major aspects of the Paris Agreement was that they reached a consensus that they set a goal कि we're going to limit global temperatures, the global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius. We'll not let it rise more than 2 degrees Celsius, as you must be all aware of this, and above 2 degrees Celsius to the pre-industrial levels. And the effort will be to keep the temperature rise to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius. They'll try to limit it to plus 1.5 of the pre-industrial levels. The next important aspect of the Paris Agreement was a commitment to reach global net zero emissions by 2050. So net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050, that was an important aspect to keep a target that they had set here. The next important aspect was mitigation, and that was through these nationally determined contributions, as you might be aware. So these were binding commitments by all parties, and this was a commitment to prepare a nationally determined contribution. And ये एक goal था कि हम इतना we'll try to reduce our emissions by this much, and this goal was to be set by the countries individually and had to be updated every 5 years. Every 5 years, this is something that has to be updated. And it was also said that there will be a global stock take. So basically यहाँ पे क्या था, this is basically to check कि countries क्या अपने objectives को meet कर रही हैं, the goal that they have set, are they able to meet, are they able to reach those goals? So it is basically a global stock take, and this is supposed to be taking place in 2023 for the first time, and then every 5 years this global stock take would be taken. This was also a key aspect of the Paris Agreement, and then this was basically to assess कि हम कितना progress कर पा रहे हैं towards reaching the objectives of this particular agreement, that is Paris Agreement. And then another aspect of this was voluntary cooperation. So there is market-based approaches here and there's non-market-based approach. So if you're aware of this market-based approach, it is basically that if अगर एक कोई country है that has set a target. Let's say there's a country that has set a target that we will reduce our emissions by, let's say, hypothetically 10 units, whatever those units are. And then there is another country also which has set its target as, let's say, 10 units. But this country has actually gone ahead and reduced 12 units, has cut down its emissions by 12 units. And this country has cut down its emissions by, let's say, 8 units or 9 units. So this country has 2 extra units. So it can be sold to this country. And this country can buy it from here by paying this country, right? And then here it can just fulfill its commitments by purchasing these 2 units. So this is a market trading mechanism. So इस Paris Agreement में जो है there is a provision for this. So bilateral cooperation through internationally traded mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, right? And there's also an Article 6.4 in this. So this article here, this subclause, basically Article 6.4, created a new international, was intended to create a new international carbon market. And this was basically to trade these emission cuts. And this was known as the Sustainable Development Mechanism, SDM. So SDM is related to Paris Agreement. So इसमें Article 6 में एक और है, this Article 6.8, and that is basically that involves non-market approach. यहाँ पर basically एक cooperation होता है between countries, जहाँ पे कोई trade involved नहीं है, but development aid, एक country दूसरे country को development aid देता है. The next key aspect of the Paris Agreement was addressing loss and damage. The next key aspect was that through the Paris Agreement, there was a framework established for financial support, for technological support, and for capacity building. Okay, and this included, for this purpose, the Green Climate Fund was there. So this includes the Green Climate Fund. So the fact here is that ये जो Green Climate Fund है, this was not established through the Paris Agreement. The Green Climate Fund was actually established by those 194 countries who are party to the UNFCCC, and this was established, the Green Climate Fund was established in 2010. But through the Paris Agreement, they came to an agreement that they will support countries, especially developing countries, in adaptation and mitigation, and the aim is to basically counter the effects of climate change. Especially ये जो countries हैं जो developing हैं या least developed countries हैं, that is the idea. Next हम ये देखेंगे कि climate change का क्या impact हुआ है इंडिया पर. So this is something that you can use to enrich your answers. Some data, you can also gather some more data if you feel like, but this is something that we can use to substantiate what has been the impact of climate change in India, right? So एक general rise in temperature हुआ है over time from 1901 to 2018. There has been a 0.7 degree Celsius rise in average temperatures. Sea surface temperature of the Indian Ocean region has also gone up, of the tropical Indian Ocean has gone up by 1 degree Celsius. इसके साथ साथ glaciers जो हैं, they have been melting, and one fact that you can use to substantiate this fact is that the glaciers in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, HKH glaciers, have declined by 15% since 1970s. Summer monsoon में भी decline हुआ है. We see extreme weather events happening, droughts, heavy rainfall. There has been a 75% increase in frequency of localized heavy rain events from 1950 to 2015 in this period of time. And more incidents of droughts. More of area is getting affected by droughts. So these are some impacts. So India's targets, the intended nationally determined contributions of India under the Paris Agreement, initially जो है 2015 में इंडिया ने ये कमिटमेंट किया था कि हम 30 से 35% रिडक्शन करेंगे एमिशन में फ्रॉम द 2005 लेवल्स. तो वी टुक द बेस लेवल एज 2005 एंड वी सेड हम 2005 से 30 से 35% कम करने की कोशिश करेंगे अपने एमिशंस को. इसमें से हमने 24% तो 2016 तक ही अचीव कर लिया था विद इन 1 year एंड वी एस्टिमेटेड टू हैव रीच्ड द 30%. सो वी हैव एक्चुअली अचीव्ड दिस टारगेट. अब न्यू अपडेटेड nationally determined contributions, we have updated this and this we have done in the previous COP26. अभी तो COP27 आ गया है, but COP26 that took place at Glasgow, there this Panchamrita was announced. That is India's new targets. And यहाँ पर ये टारगेट हमने सेट किया कि हम कार्बन इंटेंसिटी को कम करेंगे by less than 45. We'll try to make it less than 45% by 2030 from the 2005 levels. So we have reached the 30% target. Now we have moved and updated our target to 45% reduction in emissions. Okay, and we in the beginning in 2005 we set a target that we will have 40% of our electricity that is to be generated by non-fossil fuel energy by 2023. But हमने ये इसको update कर दिया है and we have now decided, we have made a commitment कि हम अपने 50% energy requirements जो है वो renewable sources से meet करेंगे. We'll meet the 50% of our energy requirements from renewable sources by 2030. तो actually में हमने 41.5% achieve कर लिया था. So we have met this target. This was actually to be done by 2023. So we have gone ahead and put forward a more ambitious target of 50% shift to 50% of our energy requirements are to be met from renewable sources by 2030. That is the idea. And then initially एक इसमें ये भी टारगेट था कि there was a target of 2.5 billion tons of additional sink, carbon sink. If you know the concept of carbon sequestration. So these trees act as sinks of carbon, and by planting, our commitment was that we will create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. अब हमारा अभी का फिलहाल का टारगेट भी यही है. इट इज सेम एज अर्लियर एंड दिस प्रोग्रेस इज नॉट वेरी क्लियर ऑन व्हाट इज हैपनिंग. अब ये जो पंचामृत है जो यहाँ पर अनाउंस किया गया था इन COP26 ग्लासगो, यहाँ पर one thing that was announced is that we aim to achieve a net zero, that is net zero emissions by 2070. This is something that we said. We made it explicit. Now this is actually slightly different from the original Paris Agreement में जो था. The idea was to have a net zero by 2050, but we have said that we will reach a net zero by 2070. And then we also announced these new targets through this Panchamrit. ठीक है, एंड इसमें 5 पॉइंट्स थे. बेसिकली इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट ये है कि हम कह रहे हैं कि हम नेट जीरो 2070 को अचीव करेंगे एंड द अदर थिंग्स दैट आई जस्ट मेंशन्ड. Now, what are the possible constraints that we can think of when it comes to India and climate change? See, one very important thing is that we are still highly dependent on coal. So the coal dependency for energy production is still high, and that is something that we need to reduce, and that is a big constraint for us at this point of time. So this shift to renewable energy is not going to be as simple because there are many constraints when it comes to renewable energy also. One is grid integration when it comes to solar power, wind energy, and also because of fluctuations in weather and climate, we cannot always rely on solar power, on wind energy. There are different constraints that they individually have, right? So that is a constraint. Renewable energy in itself has certain constraints, right? And the other thing is delayed timeline for net zero emissions. So the as per the Paris Agreement and also as per IPCC's recommendation, countries should reach a net zero emission by 2050. But we recently announced in the Panchamrit uh, at COP26 in Glasgow last year that we will reach net zero by 2070, 2070. So we are basically there is a delay from our end, and that is a constraint. And there is an absence of sectoral commitments. ये नहीं कहा गया है कि हम इस सेक्टर में का क्या टारगेट रहेगा हमारा, किस सेक्टर में हम कितना कट करेंगे. There is no sectoral commitment as far as reduction of emissions are concerned. There are also financial constraints because um, there is a need for adapting to new technology, and there is a need for mitigation and developing strategies and capacity building, and all of this requires finance. And there is actually a problem, financial constraint that exists. And apart from this, what we can say is that we can think of other more general constraints, more generic constraints, such as there is a lack of interministerial coordination, there's a lack of technical expertise. So these are certain things that we can use in most places. These constraints such as these. Okay, project clearance delays, uh, lack of investment in R&D. India invests just about 0.7% of its GDP in research and development. So that is a constraint. So as far as way forward is concerned, we can just address the constraints. We need adequate support from developed countries in the form of capacity building. They can come and help us for building capacity. They can help us in terms of finance, in terms of technology. They can provide us technological assistance. And see, there is a need of commitment from developed countries to go for net negative emissions instead of net zero. Because, see, developing countries are in a phase where they'll have to, it's very difficult for them to cut down emissions drastically because they are in the development stage. There would be industries and there would be things like that. But the developed countries are the ones who are responsible primarily for today's climate change. So a larger onus lies on these developed countries. And now that they are at a stage where they have developed enough, they have enough money and resources, they can in fact invest in मूविंग टुवर्ड्स नेट नेगेटिव एमिशंस ताकि ये जो है ऑफसेट हो जाए. So that by 2050 we can actually reach the target that we have, so that we can have a net zero emission at that point by 2050. Okay, so they can make a space and by committing to net negative emissions. So this is something that they have to come forward into developed countries, but they are reluctant to do so. That is a concern. Now, we have to eventually phase out coal. And the other thing is we should have sectoral commitments that is we should focus more on energy intensive sectors, and there should be a greater emission reduction there. Now, the next thing is when we talk about climate change in general, at the global level, there are certain ongoing debates and issues that exist. One such debate is that the NDCs, that is the nationally determined contributions that countries have given, are inadequate. They are not enough to fulfill the 1.5 degree target that is there under the Paris Agreement. So इन्होंने जो countries ने target the NDCs that they have put forward as targets are inadequate. Then the other thing is that there is shortage of funds. So there are climate financing issues. That is, there is inadequate contribution by nations, and there are delays and difficulties for developing nations, especially to access fund that is meant for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and to address loss and damage. Also, एक यहाँ पर एक चीज़ है, you are aware of this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. Common but differentiated responsibilities. So ये जो common but differentiated responsibilities है, this is a principle that was formalized in the Earth Summit, that is the UNFCCC जब formalize हुआ था, जब बना था, उस टाइम पर this concept was brought about, this principle was brought about in the Earth Summit of 1992, and ये UNFCCC के आर्टिकल्स में मेंशन्ड है बेसिकली. अब बेसिकली ये जो कॉमन बट डिफरेंशिएटेड रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी का प्रिंसिपल है, दैट acknowledges that all states have an obligation to address the destruction that is happening in the environment, but it is not that all states have an equal responsibility. It denies that equal responsibility is there with all states as far as environmental protection is concerned. Because if you see, there is a disparity when it comes to economic development between the developed countries and the developing countries. So ये जो developed countries हैं, in that industrialization came much before, it preceded and it was much earlier than in the developing countries. So this principle of common but differentiated responsibility is something that is based on the relationship that exists between industrialization and climate change. So अगर एक country ज़्यादा industrialized है, इस principle के हिसाब से that country has contributed more towards climate change, and thus there is a greater onus on that developed country to do something about climate change. So this is what is common but differentiated responsibility. अब ये क्या हुआ है recently, the debate is, ongoing debates are that over time this principle has gotten diluted. There is a dilution of this principle of common but differentiated responsibility. More developed nations, the developed nations are not taking responsibility as they should. So there is a dilution of this principle, and thus the developing countries are having to suffer, and a greater burden lies on these developing countries because they have a dual burden. Dual burden क्या है? एक development को ensure करना है, साथ ही साथ environmental protection को भी ensure करना है. So there is a dual burden on developing countries, right? The other issue is that, see, a very aggressive cut down on fossil fuels. If you suddenly, if we try to move very quickly away from fossil fuels, this may lead to a compromise this may lead to compromising with the developmental needs of developing countries. Developed countries, ये कहते हैं कि developed countries तो already they are developed, but developing countries are in a stage where they need to have more of industries, and thus it's difficult for them to maintain a balance between environmental sustainability and development. So what is the way forward here, for a general way forward for when it comes to the global level? See, countries have to actually scale up their ambition. The concern was that NDCs are insufficient. The targets that the countries have set are insufficient to meet the goal of the Paris Agreement, that is 1.5 degrees का जो goal है वो, it is insufficient. So countries have to scale up their ambitions, and there have to be strong and binding legislations for this. इसके अलावा टेक्नोलॉजिकल फ्रंट पे काम करने की जरूरत है. These are more generalistic things that we can write, generic things that we can write when it comes to way forward. See, technology, innovation, infrastructure, all of this can go into almost any kind of way forward, but you have to just tailor it according to the questions or the demand of the topic. So here also we need to have a scale up of uh, technology so that we can speed up our carbon removal process, and also there is a need for proper climate financing. There is a need for coordination between the different stakeholders that exist, and there has to be a well executed stock take. ठीक है कि there is a proper evaluation that is needed कि क्या countries ने अपने targets fulfill किए हैं. So right now the Conference of Parties COP27 is going on, COP27, and that we will see once it's completed. Uske jo outcomes, it will be all over the news. So at that point we can cover. And the development recently is that in COP27 they have said a warning was given in this COP27 that 3 times more people are displaced by disasters than war. So there is an adverse impact of climate change on the lives of people, much more than the impact of human conflicts that exist. So this COP27, its results and what are its outcomes, key outcomes, we'll discuss once it's concluded. Right now, if you have been following the last time COP26 took place, there were certain key outcomes of COP26, and we'll quickly have a cursory glance through what were the key outcomes of COP26. So यहाँ पर जो key outcome था, one was that ambition. So यहाँ पर basically ये बोला गया कि countries actually went ahead and submitted their new NDCs, that is new nationally determined contributions. Not all of them. 153 countries went ahead and submitted their new nationally determined contributions, and the countries where all the countries were requested to strengthen their ambition and make more ambitious plans for cutting down their emissions, and to strengthen their climate pledges by the end of 2022. This COP26 was the first ever COP, Conference of Parties, to explicitly target action against fossil fuels. So it targeted fossil fuels explicitly, and it called for a phase down of coal, unabated coal, and a phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So, जो fossil fuel subsidies देते हैं countries, that is also encouraging more use of fossil fuels. So, it was told here that they would target these fossil fuels and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies as well. And यहाँ पर basically finance की भी बात की गई थी. More than $350 million were pledged for the United Nations Adaptation Fund. So, I told you about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that talks about market and non-market based mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. So it was here in COP26 that this was finalized, and एक चीज यहाँ पर ये भी कही गई कि the carbon credits that were generated under the Kyoto Protocol since 2013 would be carried over into the Paris mechanism, but that must be used over by 2030. So यहाँ पर Kyoto Protocol के अंदर भी there was a carbon credit mechanism, the market mechanism, and वहाँ पर जो there are certain credits. अब यहाँ पर बोला गया कि we can carry forward those credits and use it here, use it under the Paris agreement, but we must use that exhausted by 2030. एक और चीज जो यहाँ पे हुई थी, a key outcome was that a Glasgow dialogue was created for funding of loss and damage, and developed countries pledged to support the Santiago network. अब ये Santiago network जो है, this could be relevant. अब Santiago network is basically a website that is set up by the UNFCCC, and this has links to organizations like development banks, and this is intended to support loss and damage mitigation mechanisms. तो लॉस एंड डैमेज को एड्रेस करने के लिए है ये सैंटियागो नेटवर्क. Here also something that we can note is that India became a signatory to the Breakthrough Agenda. A Breakthrough Agenda basically is an agenda that aims to have affordable and clean technologies uh, in emitting sectors, in the sectors that cause a lot of emission. So उन sectors में clean technologies लाने के लिए they have come up with this breakthrough agenda. Next, quickly we'll have a look at the Stockholm Conference. So 2022 marked actually the 50 years of Stockholm Conference. So just we'll have a glance at this as well quickly, but now ये जो Stockholm Conference था, as I told you, was UN's first major conference on international environmental issues, right? And इसके साथ एक turning point आया in the development of international environment politics. It was organized in 1972, and this was basically done with the aim of safeguarding the natural environment that we have. And the theme of the Stockholm Conference was Only One Earth. And at this point, 122 countries adopted the Stockholm Declaration, and it was here that for the first time countries formally agreed not to harm each other's environment beyond, so they would respect each other's environment, and there was a plan that was put out to study the environment of the earth. And one very important outcome of this was the establishment of what we know as UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. So this was a very important outcome of the Stockholm Conference. So one of the key outcomes that if you have to remember is that UNEP was established in 1972 through the Stockholm Conference. And from that time, there have been many important agreements that come under the UNEP, including the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol for the protection of ozone layer, the Basel Convention that is meant for the transboundary movement of hazardous wastes, and then the Convention on Biological Diversity, UNFCCC, UNCCD, that is United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and then the Rotterdam Convention, the Stockholm Convention of POPs, that is persistent organic pollutants, the Minamata Convention of 2013. All of this are multilateral environmental agreements under UNEP. So UNEP has played a very important role, and UNEP was established via the Stockholm Conference. Okay, and one more thing is I forgot to mention the setbacks of the COP26. Just very quickly, see, ये जो COP26 हुआ था, उसमें one of the major drawbacks was that countries have been told to strengthen their ambitions, but this has been done undermining historic responsibility. Like I told you, over time there has been a dilution of this concept, this principle of common but differentiated responsibility. सारे countries को बोला गया है कि अपने targets को strengthen करिए, and there is no differentiation, that there is no particular emphasis made on the fact that the targets that should be set by the developed countries should be much more stronger than those set by the developing countries, because as I told you, there's a dual onus in developing countries, that is environmental sustainability as well as development. So the greater onus should lie on the developed countries, but that was undermining they have undermined this historic responsibility. And the targeted action that was done against fossil fuels actually was said that it would disproportionately again impact the developing countries, because fossil fuels for developing countries are fossil fuels are a means to provide accessible and affordable energy to their citizens. So that is the basic requirement of developing countries is fulfilled through fossil fuels. So again, there's a disproportionate impact that can occur in these developing countries. And again, the onus was not taken by the developed nations. And There was no discussion about the compensation that should be coming from the developed nation, because there was no financial mechanism to address loss and damage. And the discussion was just restricted to technical assistance and insurance and things like that. But there was no discussion on the liability that the developed nations have. Now, the other thing is, as I told you, this carbon credits would be carried forward. जो Kyoto Protocol के carbon credits हैं, that would be carried forward. So this would, kind of slacken the efforts, because you're carrying forward those credits from the Kyoto Protocol, and it would make limiting this make it would make it difficult to limit global warming as per the targets of the Paris Agreement. And then it would have impact on more vulnerable nations, especially the island nations, right? So another small thing, carbon inequality. Although we've already discussed it to a certain extent. See, carbon inequality, recently एक study था जहाँ पर ये पाया गया कि wealthy people have much more higher uh, wealthy people have much higher carbon footprints as compared to the others. So wealthy people have disproportionately large carbon footprints, and तो उसमें बेसिकली दो तरह की इनइक्वालिटीज हैं. वन इज कार्बन इनइक्वालिटी बिटवीन नेशंस, right? Because a smaller number of developed nations are responsible for much of the share of these carbon dioxide emissions. And within nations also there is inequality, right? Because higher income, the group that has the higher income groups have a larger carbon footprint. So carbon emissions of higher groups are much significant. So within nations also there is a carbon inequality. That is between the rich people and the others. Next, we look at the different impacts of climate change, and we have to look at it from different dimensions, right? Especially we'll have to look at the impacts of climate change on the vulnerable sections of the society. So this also has a link with the society aspect. So climate change does have more impact on vulnerable sections like women, children, and we'll look at that. But उससे पहले जो general impact है climate change का, वो ये है कि there are irreversible changes that are happening. For instance, Amazon rainforests are now witnessing frequent droughts. Arctic sea ice, there is a massive loss of Arctic sea ice. There is a slowdown in Atlantic circulation. There is an increase in fires in forests, especially the boreal forests. And there are massive die-offs that are seen in coral reefs. And the Greenland ice sheet loss is accelerating. Permafrost is that section of the earth that is generally permanently frozen, and that is starting to melt. And a lot of the Antarctic ice is also starting to melt. And if you also know about the concept of Arctic amplification that is happening. So the influence of climate change, global warming, is felt much more on the Arctic region than the Antarctic region. One of the primary reasons being that the Arctic region is surrounded by more landmass, so that heats up much quicker than the Antarctic region, which is surrounded by oceans and water bodies. इसके अलावा there is an impact on biodiversity. A lot of species are getting extinct. Climate caused local extinctions are happening. There is a poleward shift of species, and there is an adverse impact obviously on humans as well. There is an impending threat of food scarcity, water security. There is an adverse impact of this on physical and mental health. Heat-related illnesses are going up, waterborne diseases are going up, vector-borne diseases are going up because of climate change. Now, also there is economic loss due to destruction from extreme events that are taking place. And then there is Also, humanitarian crisis, as has been pointed out recently in the COP27 as well, that three times more people are getting displaced due to uh, climate change than due to war. So that is happening, displacement of people is happening. But now we will look at very specific impacts of climate change on vulnerable sections. See, there is a disproportionate impact on women primarily because of the patriarchal nature of the society. One reason is that there is a heightened burden of household responsibilities on women. Apart from that, there is limited mobility because of societal norms that women have, and thus there is a heightened vulnerability and more exposure to climate change related extreme weather events. There is also a lack of gender sensitive disaster planning. When we plan for disasters, we do not incorporate the needs of women in that. So there's a lack of gender sensitive disaster planning. And because of the strain on limited resources, there is an increase in violence against women. So the need of the hour is to integrate gender perspectives into mitigation and adaptation. And there is a need for heightened awareness, gender awareness. There has to be a gender sensitive approach. The next category of vulnerable sections is children. So children are basically disproportionately impacted as a result of climate change because children are physically, physiologically, and emotionally more vulnerable than adults uh, to shocks that come in the environment, and they children are at a greater risk of not being treated properly because they could be subject to abuse, trafficking, exploitation. So there is a greater risk when displacement happens in because of extreme weather events. There is a greater risk of this kind of maltreatment, trafficking, and children are more likely to lose access to basics such as health, nutrition, education, and they are more likely to be subject to child labor, maybe child marriage. क्या होता है जब एक child जब when a child loses access to basic things such as education, such as proper nutrition, this is going to affect the entire life of the child. So, any deprivation that is occurring as a result of climate change and environment degradation can result in a lifetime of lost opportunity. Another thing we can note down here is that there is an index that is released by the UNICEF, that has been introduced by the UNICEF, which is known as the Children's Climate Risk Index. Okay, so you can remember from the prelims perspective that this is released or introduced by UNICEF, and this is basically an index that provides a comprehensive view of children's vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. किस तरह से climate change children को affect करेगा. Now, the other vulnerable section is the indigenous people, right? Now, what happens is one direct impact इनके lives पर ये पड़ता है because of extreme weather events. They are forced to get displaced. Especially if you look at very small island nations or places that are very much prone to extreme weather events, to getting affected by these extreme weather events. So those people are actually adversely affected, and it affects their traditional way of living and their traditional knowledge. There is, of course, damage to land, water, and it negatively impacts their life. And the other thing is, there is not much importance that is given to these indigenous people, or not much importance given to the vulnerability of these people, and we can see that there is a systemic discrimination against indigenous people, and there is not enough finance or not enough financial resources and measures that are taken to help uh, these indigenous people. In a lot of instances, they are not involved in decision making. So there is a need to promote their participation in decision making because they are stakeholders here, and a rights based approach is needed. And capacity building is required for adaptation among these indigenous communities. And also, there is a requirement to expand the funding that is available to help them adapt to the changing climate, help them mitigate the effects. The next section of vulnerable people is this refugees or migrants. So, one major issue related to these refugees, people who are forced to leave their spaces due to effects of extreme weather events or because of climate change, such people, such refugees, are not recognized in any international convention like the 1951 Refugee Convention. They are not recognized as refugees. So, there is a need to include them in the definition of refugees. The other thing is, it is very difficult to identify the victims of slower onset impacts of climate change. So eventually maybe एक जगह है जहाँ पर slowly over the years that place becomes uninhabitable, and then slowly people start moving out. So it's difficult to pinpoint exactly, and there is a growing xenophobic tendency across the globe. People coming from another place are not welcome, are not treated kindly. There is hate against people because there is a feeling that these people would come and encroach on our land. So that kind of a treatment that is needed, that kind of a compassionate treatment to these refugees is missing, and the will to help is also missing. The other section that is vulnerable, especially to climate change, is the small island developing states. So, SIDS, as it is called, small island developing states. So, this is basically a distinct group of 39 developing island countries, as has been classified by the United Nations. So, geographically, these SIDS, that is the small island developing states, are located in the Pacific Ocean, in the Caribbean, Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea. The SIDS, small island developing states, account for just about 1% of the global carbon dioxide emissions, but they are faced with severe consequences of climate change, and they are very much vulnerable to these climate events, especially a sea level rise, and especially they are more susceptible to cyclones or hurricanes or hydrometeorological hazards, and their economies are very fragile, and usually they are dependent on aid, and their revenue base is very narrow. Their revenue comes from sectors such as tourism, fisheries, and they rely much on aid that is given to them. And they are very vulnerable, and they have very unique challenges because they're dependent on imports for food security, for energy, and there is a lack of climate finance access for them, complex requirements, and there are policy constraints. So, the need of the hour is to invest in disaster risk reduction programs, and they have to be given due importance, and because they are very much vulnerable to extreme events, uh, and a lot of island nations are at the risk of vanishing in the near future because of the increasing sea levels, melting of ice. So, one direct impact that we should be aware of is the impact of climate change and cryosphere, especially the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. So there are studies that have found that glaciers across the Himalayas are melting at an extraordinary rate. They are melting really, really fast. And this is a major matter of concern. The Hindu Kush Himalayan region basically has the largest reserves of ice outside the polar regions, and it is the source of 10 major Asian rivers. There are diverse cultures, languages, religions, and knowledge, traditional knowledge systems that exist here, and this has very high biodiversity. There are important bird areas, biodiversity areas, and 4 global biodiversity hotspots that exist in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. So we know that this is a very, very crucial region, and the effect of melting glaciers on this region can have adverse consequences. So there is an increased intensity and frequency of climate change hazards in this region. There is a term that you might have heard that has been in news quite often, that is the glacial lake outburst floods. तो क्या होता है कि जब glaciers melt होने लगते हैं, so there are these moraines that are there at the end. So these get filled. So these regions get filled with water that melts from these glaciers, and there is a lake kind of thing that is formed. But because these moraines are very weak, there is a huge, and these lakes get formed at different regions in the Himalayas, and because these boundaries that hold the lake are not very strong, there is a tendency that there is a possibility that these can break very easily. And जब ये break कर जाते हैं, so all of this water that has accumulated in this lake from these melted glaciers can lead to immense flooding in the surrounding areas. And this is really dangerous. Flash floods can happen. And this can pose a significant risk to the mountain habitats, people who live in the mountains. Because of melting glaciers, there is a declining snow cover, drying up of rivers in the long run, and it also affects hydropower, energy generation. There is a degradation of water quality, and very importantly, it has an impact on the livelihoods of people who live in the mountain region, and in the long run, people who are dependent on these rivers that originate in this region, for instance, Ganga, all of this will get impacted. And so this can have huge economic consequences as well, adverse economic consequences. It can have effect on biodiversity, as I said. Now, there is this term that is known as the third pole. This third pole basically includes the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush region, Pamirs, and the Tian Shan Mountains. In all of this is also included, right? So this third pole, जो lakes हैं, there is a study that has been done, and findings are that lakes are growing in size in this third pole region, and lakes have grown, and this has happened because mountain glaciers have shrunk, and this is because of rising temperatures, and there is an increasing ice loss. So that is why this region, the third pole region, has been in news. And one thing that that we should know is the Karakoram Anomaly. So this is the Karakoram range over here, shown in yellow. अब काराकोरम अनोमली क्या है, ये जानना हमारे लिए प्रीलिम्स के लिए इम्पोर्टेंट हो सकता है, and even in general we should have an idea. तो basically बाकी Himalayan regions में there is a continuous retreat of glaciers or melting of glaciers that is taking place in the nearby mountain ranges. But ये Karakoram range में, there is in the central Karakoram range, there is a growth of glaciers as opposed to the retreat of glaciers that is happening in the surrounding region. So ये एक anomaly है कि काराकोरम रेंज में जो है glaciers बढ़ रहे हैं, but in the surrounding regions it is melting. So this is what is termed as Karakoram anomaly. So for a long time, it was unclear why this is happening, but a study has highlighted that it could be because of enhanced western disturbances. Western disturbance में जो precipitation होता है, that could be responsible for it. The western disturbances basically primarily feed the snowfall in winter time here, and so it is said that precipitation from the western disturbances feed this anomaly and are responsible for this anomaly. But nevertheless, we should just have an idea that there is an anomaly that exists in the Karakoram range, in the central Karakoram range, and this is what is known as the Karakoram anomaly. The next very important impact of climate change is that on oceans. So as you're all aware that more than 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by oceans, and oceans, because of climate change, there is an impact that is seen on the oceans as well. So ocean warming is taking place, and as you're aware, because of ice melting, there's a rise in the sea levels as well. But ocean warming is happening, and also thermal expansion of oceans is happening because oceans absorb the excess heat in the climate system. Ocean acidification is a very important phenomena that is taking place, and the oceans also act as sinks of carbon. So we can say that the carbon dioxide, excess carbon dioxide here, this is taken up. So oceans take up between 20 to 30% of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions that have happened since 1980. So there has been increased CO2. So there is जब carbon dioxide इसमें आ जाता है तो a weak carbonic acid kind of thing forms, and that is why there is a tendency for oceans to get acidified. And जब पानी का pH बदलता है तो automatically it affects the living organisms, the marine ecosystem, and any change, temperature change, pH change, all of that impacts the ecosystems, the marine ecosystems. And ocean warming leads to coral bleaching, as you're all aware. And see, there is deoxygenation that is happening. So जो dissolved oxygen रहता है oceans में, that is decreasing, and that is because of ocean regions getting warmer. So there is a temperature-driven solubility decrease that is taking place. So these ocean circulations are also weakening, and which play a very, very important role, as you might have studied in geography. So the role of ocean currents are extremely important, but there are changes that are happening in ocean circulations, such as the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation is weakening, right? And there's an increased frequency of storms and hurricanes that are taking place. See, ocean currents are also very important for the coastal economy, especially in regions that are rich fishing grounds. So, if these regions get affected, then it will lead to a destruction of the livelihoods of people in those regions. So there is an enhanced risk to food security and coastal infrastructure and livelihood, and there is a risk of extinctions, accelerated melting of sea ice, and regional climate पे भी फर्क पड़ता है because of ocean circulation, because of changing ocean circulation patterns. And if people migrate from one region to another because of climate induced extreme events, and that could lead to transboundary conflicts as well. Another important consequence here is ocean stratification. What happens is that there is a vertical separation of layers that occurs because of surface getting warmed, and because of the stratification there is a reduction in the ocean nutrient levels in the upper regions. Because of the stratification in the upper regions, nutrients come ho jate hain, and this can affect the system again. So there could be harmful algal blooms that take place. There are in fact harmful algal blooms that are taking place. So one thing next that we can note is this Clydebank declaration for green shipping corridors. So ये जो है, this was an agreement between 22 countries, and this was launched in the previous COP, that is COP 26, Conference of Parties 26, the previous one that took place in Glasgow, the climate summit. And India has not signed this. India did not sign it last time. And see, a green corridor basically क्या होता है? A green corridor is basically a shipping route. दो major port hubs के बीच में this is a shipping route, and इस shipping route में they basically try to achieve zero emission ships. Okay, and this is done by concerted public action, private action. So it is basically to achieve zero emission shipping trade routes, and this is intended to decarbonize the global maritime industry. तो ये जो क्लाइडबैंक डिक्लेरेशन था फॉर ग्रीन शिपिंग कॉरिडोर्स, यहाँ पर कंट्रीज 22 countries agreed to establish 6 green corridors by 2025. 2025 तक they decided कि we'll establish 6 green corridors. Okay, and India did not sign this, and there are a lot of challenges when it comes to green shipping in India. One of the major challenges is that it is very difficult to secure investment or funds to replace the existing ships with eco-friendly ships. Okay? And we are using polluting fuel, and it's very difficult to make this transition at suddenly. Okay, we have to invest a lot, and there is a lack of investment here, and there is an inadequate quality of intermodal infrastructure. So इसकी वजह से क्या होता है, that is because of lack of railway connectivity with waterways, connectivity with highways. This leads to more of cargo being handled by shipping, and this causes more emissions. Also, there is a seasonal reversal of winds that occurs because of changing weather conditions. And इससे क्या होता है कि there is a deviation in shipping routes, and because of that more fuel consumption takes place, and thus there are more emissions on our side. Now but it is not that India has not taken any initiative when it comes to green ports and green shipping. India has taken certain initiatives. So India has signed an agreement under the IMO, that is the International Maritime Organization, wherein India has pledged to cut the greenhouse gas emissions of the shipping industry by 50% by 2050. इसके अलावा India is also a member of the IMO, that is the International Maritime Organization, and India is a signatory to this Marpol Convention, that is the International Convention on Prevention of Prevention of Marine Pollution. So India also aims to increase its share of renewable energy across the different ports that we have. So this is what we with this we have almost covered all dimensions of climate change and climate change in India especially, and we have seen its impact on the different sections. Next, we will have a look at air pollution, especially Delhi's air pollution, and which has also been in news in the recent times. So over the past few years, Delhi's air pollution has consistently been in news at this particular time of the year, every year, from October to November. So basically, there are different factors for this, and we'll just look at it. The main culprit is particulate matter, and particulate matter जो है दो तरीके का है यहाँ पे 2.5 and PM2.5 and PM10. So PM2.5 is that particular particulate matter जिसके particles का size जो है वो 2.5 micrometers से कम है, and similarly 10 ये 10 micrometers. So the current levels are far beyond the limit that has been set by WHO and even the national limits, and these particulate matter, that is PM2.5 and PM10, are the main culprits for high pollution of Delhi and the surrounding regions. Okay, now iske karan kya hai? What are the reasons for this, or what are the factors for this? So we can look at it. We can look at two broad factors. One is geographical factors, and second, anthropogenic factors. So geographical reasons में सबसे पहला reason है location of Delhi. So Delhi ऐसे जगह में located है that basically is towards the northeast of the Thar Desert. We can say it is towards the southwest of the Himalayas, and it is also to the northwest of the Central Plains. So it is in a region that basically, so as winds arrive from the coasts to this region here, what happens is that they bring with them a lot of pollutants along the way, and यहाँ पर जाकर this gets trapped right before the Himalayas. So location is a very important factor as far as Delhi is concerned. Now the other reason is cold temperature during winter. So summer में क्या होता है कि hot air rises above the surface and उसके साथ साथ वो pollutants लेकर ऊपर जाता है. But अक्टूबर नवंबर के टाइम में एयर उतना गर्म नहीं है, and pollutants जो है they are trapped and they tend to get concentrated at the lower levels of the atmosphere. So वो ऊपर नहीं जा पाते हैं pollutants, and this results in smoke and a haze-like situation. The other reason is lack of wind. अब lack of wind यहाँ पर basically winter में जो average speed है in Delhi, average wind speed in Delhi, NCR region is very low, and it is much lower than what it is in summer, 1/3 of what it is in summer, and this makes pollution concentration. This makes the region prone to pollutant concentration. एक और reason ये भी है कि it's said that 40% of this particulate matter that is there in Delhi, we can trace it back to storms that originate in the Middle East. So multi-day storms जो हैं वो Middle East में होते हैं, and that is one reason we can trace these particulate matter back to those multi-day dust storms that originate in the Middle Eastern region. Now another thing that we have to look at is the anthropogenic factors responsible for this. So stubble burning is one reason that we are all aware of, and it has consistently been in news over the years. This next one being government policy. So what happened is that there was a water crisis, there was a growing water crisis in Punjab and Haryana region, and for that वहाँ के governments ने क्या किया, वहाँ के governments ने एक law introduce किया जिसमें they delayed the kharif cropping. So they delayed it so that it comes in line with monsoon, and उसकी वजह से क्या होता है, they harvest it at this particular time, and the time between the harvest and the next sowing season is very low. So this actually leads farmers to burn the crops. So and this worsens the pollution, and that is the main cause for stubble burning. The other one is vehicular emission. Okay, so vehicular emission is a major contributor to Delhi's increasing air pollution. It has also been cited as a major contributor by the Central Pollution Control Board. इसके अलावा citizen participation जो है वो काफ़ी कम है. There's a very lackadaisical approach, very uninterested approach that the citizens have. So there's minimum citizen participation, unlike in other parts of the world. So citizens के तरफ से भी efforts उतने नहीं हैं जितने होने चाहिए. So we can say that minimum citizen participation is one reason also. इसके अलावा poor regulations can be cited as one of the reasons. Now bans are not imposed where they should be imposed. A lot of small factories are not encouraged to adopt environment-friendly measures, and a proper hand-holding is not given to them to make this transition into becoming more environment-friendly. Now, looking at the impacts. So, on adults, there was a report that was published by Lancet, and this is a statistic that you can quote. It can help you in your answers to add value to your answers. That is, there was a report by Lancet that said that 12.5% of deaths in India occurred due to air pollution. Also, there was a report that was titled The State of Global Air Report in 2020, wherein it was stated that more than 1 lakh infants died within a month of their birth in 2019 due to air pollution, both outdoor and indoor pollution. So indoor pollution is also a thing, right? And it has impacts on mothers and pregnant women. Because of high pollution, there is it affects the placenta and the fetus, and so this can be really detrimental in that sense. So also on education, there is an impact. Closure of schools. So because of this, hours are lost, and severe air pollution in Delhi leads to the closure of schools, as has been happening, and closure of industries and factories, limits on construction activity can also adversely affect economic activity and thus have an impact on the economy. So what are the steps that have been taken by the government? So first of all, the graded response action plan. So pursuant to the Supreme Court order in the C. Mehta versus Union of India case, so a graded response action plan was prepared for implementation under different air quality, under the different air quality index categories, that is AQI, and accordingly moderate, poor, very poor, severe categories. The air quality is categorized into these categories. Then there was also this National Clean Air Program. The National Clean Air Program has a goal of reducing the concentration of PM10 and PM2.5 by at least 20% by the year 2024. So this was the target, and base year क्या है यहाँ पे 2017 was the base year for comparison. Okay, इसके अलावा बहुत सारे और measures लिए गए हैं, ex situ and in situ measures. So if we talk about in situ solutions, there have been solutions. There is different solutions that have been rolled out by union and state. One being turbo happy seeders, जहाँ पर usually what happens is that if there is a stubble, क्या होता है कि the harvester usually, if this is your remaining crop, so जब वो cut हो जाता है तो इतना सा they cut it from here, and so इसका residue जो है वो रह जाता है. So there is no option with the farmers within the limited time to get rid of this. The option that they have is to burn this away. So happy seeders deal with this. They do not. Here people do not have to really, the farmers do not really have to burn it off, and they can then, this is basically intended to help with the problem of stubble burning, right? Now then there are biodecomposers that have been given. There is also Delhi's Green War Room, which is basically which basically is signaling the fight against smog, and it analyzes satellite data on farm fires from Punjab and Haryana, and this is basically to identify what the culprits are. So this is a certain effort. And then cleaner transport. So government's push towards electronic vehicles shows a promise actually, and so the way forward will be basically to have better farming practices. There is a need of political will to act. See, we are making a transition from petrol vehicles. Eventually we are moving towards electronic vehicles, especially at a time when the global geopolitics is such that we are forced to give away our are forced to reduce our dependence on crude oil. We are moving towards electronic vehicles, EVs. So this is actually a good opportunity for us to also address the problem of pollution by adopting like EVs, and it's also important to have better farming practices, and there is a need for better coordination. So the Indian Agricultural Research Institute basically recently proposed a low cost way to deal with stubble burning, and they proposed, उन्होंने क्या किया, उन्होंने एक proposition दिया है कि they have a chemical solution that will help in decomposing the crop residue, and then that can be turned into manure. So there is a need for greater awareness, greater participation of all the stakeholders involved to address this. So facing a growing environmental and health calamity, anti-pollution efforts are actually being strengthened, but there is a need to harness the political will, and there is a need to coordinate across the boundaries, because it is not just, we may have physical boundaries, we may have boundaries within a state, but the what is being done in one state is reaching another. So we have to coordinate across boundaries, and there is a need for people to get involved. A greater involvement of people is needed, and enhanced awareness is required. So the video has already become long, so that is it. We'll stop here for today for this discussion, and I'll continue with more topics. I'll probably pick up international relations in the next video, and also try and cover certain topics from science and tech, and as time permits, we will pick up more topics, and we'll come back to environment in another session, and we have discussed a substantial amount of content for today, and I hope this video was useful.